Hey photography fans, Andrew here from Azulux and Azulux Workshops. Today we're going to do a walkthrough of an edit of a simple nighttime landscape photo I took in Joshua Tree over the summer. Simple photo, Joshua Tree in the front, rocks in the midground, stars in the background. We're going to take the photo from Capture One where we process the raw file. We're going to export it out, open it up in Affinity Photo, and we're then going to break it into layers, creating some masks. And we're going to tweak those layers using simple tools such as the curve tool, white balance adjustment layer, and the hue saturation layer. We're also going to do some noise processing using frequency separation to produce a really nice looking final result. We have a lot of control over how the image comes together, foreground, midground, and background. So let's go ahead and check that out.
So my goal here in Capture One is to get the image looking as good as I can. This process is pretty quick and painless, and the better it looks here, the less work I have to do in the next step in Affinity Photo. So I'm just trying to use more of the histogram, just trying to get it close to what my vision was, a little more contrast, a little more saturation, which I do via curves and the levels tool usually. So once I'm happy with that, I'm just going to export it. I'm going to export it to a 16-bit PSD file. Turns out that's the best exchange format that got available for Affinity. Make sure I disable sharpening, and then go ahead and click export. So here we are in Affinity. I'm going to go ahead and open up the PSD file I just exported. There's the output from Capture One. The first step I usually do is try to look at it, make a plan, and then I usually duplicate the base layer and save it so I have something to compare to. So my next step is going to be to clean the file. I want to remove any unwanted artifacts that shouldn't really be there. In this case, that's going to be plane trails, or maybe it's a meteor, but it just doesn't add to the photo. It looks like something that shouldn't be there behind the Joshua Tree, and there's a couple of those around the image. So I'm going to use Affinity's in-painting tool. Move stars around a little bit, but not really a big deal unless you're trying to do a scientific reproduction of the sky, in which case you have to be more careful. We're not doing that. Looks like there's a little dust spot here on the left side. You're going to get rid of that. Scroll around the image. Let's look and see what else we've got. While I'm thinking about it, I'm going to go ahead and rename this layer to cleaned, so I can keep track of what's what. We're going to build a few layers here, and it's helpful to know what they are. Bouncing around. Anything else I want to take care of? So I think we're going to remove this tree right here. It didn't bother me at the time. Whoops. Undo that. Be a little more careful this time and actually only paint over the tree. Use inpainting, and looks pretty good. Happy with that. And the other thing that bugs me is this bush down here. So I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of that. See what inpainting does with that. Did a pretty good job. We're not even going to do any work on the tree. Tree looks pretty good. The shadow along the bottom edge. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of that for a good bit of the horizon line. Good. So now, one more little thing. I duplicated that layer. Want to get rid of the extra duplications. Let's make this smaller, and we're going to go ahead and remove one more plane trail I'd missed. I think that's everything. So Now our next step is going to be to sort of mask out the different areas of the image so that we can manipulate them individually. And in this image, you really have three areas. You've got the rock, the tree, and the sky. So I'm going to duplicate this base 3 times. So I've got 3 copies of it. And we're going to start with the sky, so I'll just rename that using the select tool. Make it big. Oh, selected everything, not really an issue. Switch to subtract. And we're just going to try to subtract out the rock. I'm not going to worry about the tree too much. This process doesn't have to be super precise. This is just a first take. We're going to actually refine this as the next step. So once you've got a rough mask, you click the little mask button, and it adds a mask to that layer. So now if I turn off the other layers, there's what's showing that layer. So turn everything back on, hit Control D to clear the selection, get rid of the marching ants. I'm just going to go ahead and rename this other layer so that I've got it renamed tree for when I get ready to work on that. So now we're going to refine the mask we're using for the sky. So right off the bat, when you open this up, Affinity applies a masking operation and attempts to better fit the edges that you were close to. And then what I find helpful is once you've painted any big errors, take the masking brush and just go around the edge, along the edge, trying to get as close to the center as possible. And Affinity should be smart enough to figure out what's like the foreground, what's like the background nearby. If it didn't to begin with. Some of these areas I don't really need to go over again, but I'm going to. I'm going to get the easy stuff first. I'm going to start with a rock because that's a pretty simple mask. The tree will be a little bit more of a project, and we'll see that. It's a little tedious, but it's just a matter of being patient and working around the tree, painting in the background mask where appropriate, and the foreground mask, and then matting the edges as needed. The rock area is looking pretty good. Now, for the complicated one. We're going to start by just painting the background mask. Find this little hole right here. Background mask over the actual tree. Again, this is sort of tedious, but after a few minutes of work, you can get the tree mask in pretty well without too much gnashing of teeth. So for those of you not keeping track, that took about 7.5 minutes to mask this tree in, which is pretty respectable given the complexity involved. And you'll see in a minute, this mask is pretty high quality. I won't have to do much more to it, but the other great thing about this process is this is all non-destructive. All I have to do if I want to revise, there's some problem, I can come back and work just on a problem spot later. So I've got myself to a working state, and now I can move forward trying to process the file and deal with any difficulties as they come up later on. So now I've got a mask for the sky, and one of the things I can do with that, rather than wasting my time remasking this Joshua tree in with all of its delicacy, if we can duplicate this mask, and copy it over to our tree mask, and then modify it to keep the rest of the tree and get rid of the rocks. So this is pretty straightforward. It's Command J. Now you just drag it down until it gets accepted as a mask on this one. Select the mask, Command I to invert it. Now you can see we've got everything but the sky, which is part of what we want. So we're going to refine this mask, and then we're going to remove the rock so we just have the tree. That big. Now we're going to paint in the background, which is the red part. And again, we don't have to be super precise because we're going to refine as we go here. I'm just going to cover all the rock up. Close to this tree. Just try to get it close. It may be smart enough to figure out what the edge of the tree is. It may not. Now that we've done the gross work, we're going to start with the more close-up work. We're just going to start by trying to match the curve of the inside of this tree closely. And once again, we're going to let the power of matting help refine this once we get close. Now we're just going to go over that edge again like we did. The smaller it is, the better job it tends to do. You want to use the smallest matte brush you can that matches sort of the size of the details you're matting over the top of. This is fairly hard to do with a mouse or a trackball. I have a Wacom tablet. That helps a lot with trying to follow these organic shapes. At least once you've practiced a little bit, it's a little frustrating to start with. I'm the first to admit. Pretty close. A little bit of bleeds on the edge there, but that won't matter because that's black on black, so it probably is not going to show up with the type of editing we're going to do. And if it does, we can always tweak later on. So there it is, sky, and then the rocks we don't have to make an explicit mask for because it's just the background. So let's start by trying to work on our sky here and make it a little prettier. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a white balance layer. These layers are automatically adjustment layers. Drag that down into here so it's nested. Not going to let me do that with this window open. Let's kill that. There we go. Now it's nested, not only affects that layer. So now we can just go, I'm going to drag it really extreme to show you. So there's really extreme. You can see it's not really affecting anything but the sky. So here's where you start getting that choice of what you want things to look like. I particularly like a fairly blue sky. So once you get the white balance where you like it, we're going to play with the curves. You'll notice that with a layer selected inside that layer, adjustment layer inside that layer, it went ahead and created the new one inside there as well. And we'll just kind of play with that and get it to where we like it. And if you screw up, the great thing about this is it's all non-destructive. You can change your mind later. So let's say, oh, well, now I've got too many points on here, and let's just start over. So really what I'm doing right here is I'm trying to get the sky to be a nice crystal-y blue. So we've got darks where it should be dark, and the stars are nice and bright. We've got a little bit of the northern end of the Milky Way there, which you see directly over the Joshua Tree. Before, after. Now we're going to use one of my other favorite tricks. Which is to use frequency separation, which does a great job of removing noise from skies in nighttime photos. So we're going to check this preserve checkbox. And then play with the size here. And the goal with this slider is to try to get, so I'm going to zoom in and show you what that's doing. If you look really close, you see how plastically the stars got. So the sky is absolutely smooth, and the stars are sort of points on it. It looks a little fake. Go to the other extreme. Notice how there's more noise coming in. You can see more speckling in the sky. See how it's kind of grainy now? Not bad, but it's still there. So what I try to do is I usually try to do something where there's some variation in the sky, but it's not totally plastic looking. Now, when we do frequency separation, we get two layers. We get a high frequency and a low frequency layer. And it duplicates all the internal stuff. So we usually remove those from the high frequency because that doesn't really make any sense. And then I create a group for that. I'm going to rename that group sky. And then I drag both of those in there. So now, there we go. So now that group layer is the sky. And I've got a high frequency and a low frequency. And the low frequency represents, in this case, all of the non-noise detail because of the way we did the high frequency separation. It's not the kind of high frequency separation we do for beauty portraits. It's more of a noise reduction strategy. So now I can play with the opacity on that high frequency to get things look the way I want. And usually what I'll do is I'll zoom in and just play with the opacity on that until I get about the right amount of noise. Too little, it looks fake, and too much, we're right back where we started. If I make that 100%, it's going to look exactly like we started. So that high frequency layer in this case is actually the noise in the sky. And so you can make a decision after the fact how much noise you want. Again, it's all non-destructive, so you can, if you get done and go, well, this is too much noise again, you can go back there and pull that out. You can also flatten those two layers back together and then re-frequency separate them again if you want. It's good to save at some point. So now we're going to do basically the same thing we did in the sky, which is we're going to work via the masked tree layer we created. And we're going to adjust the white balance, sort of the curves, the contrast, the saturation, and sort of get the tree to look the way we want it to look. So now you can see, turn this layer on and off. Tree before, tree after. So now we're going to repeat the same process a third time on the rock layer. So we'll start by duplicating our clean base and renaming it rocks. So now I think the first thing I want to do is add a little clarity on this front face where the light is shining. It's a little muddy. So this layer, this adjustment layer only applies to the rocks layer. And you can see as I change the slider, the rocks get sharper or less sharp. Zoom in. So it looks pretty good on the areas I want it. However, the shadow areas where the light's not shining, I've basically sharpened the noise there, and that's not really what I want. So I'm going to use the fact that this is already a masked layer, this adjustment layer, and I'll paint it in only in the areas that I want it, which is just over the front edge of the rock where the light is shining and it should be fairly sharp. since this layer is masked in already, since there's layers on top of it, I don't have to worry about sharpening the sky. I'm, in fact, sharpening it in this layer, but it doesn't matter because the sky layer is on top, and so you won't see anything except for just the rock in this area. If there's anything else I want to sharpen to start with. There's a before and after. I think one last thing I want to try to deal with is this area of the rock that's a little gray and noisy over here in the shadow. And so one of the ways I think I want to do that is I'm going to create an HSL layer, and I'm going to try to bring up the saturation and maybe darken it down a little bit, but I just want to do that in the area that's here and not to the rest of the rock. So same principle, paint in the areas you want to be there. So I'm going to shift this a lot so you can see it shift. So I've just got those areas. I want to try to find a hue shift that doesn't look silly. So it's going to be probably just a little bit on the warmer side. And a little more to the mask since I'm painting pretty opaque. Pretty transparent. And then turn the saturation up so you can see what you're doing, and then turn it back down. So then we're going to bring the brightness down a little bit so it looks a little bit less bright, because it kind of looked artificially bright. Now it looks more like the shadow should look. So now I want to step back and take a look at the entire image. I think I want to tweak the sky a little bit more. So we'll do that on the low frequency layer using one of our existing adjustment layers. Start with white balance. And once that's close to where I want it, or rather where I want it, I'm almost done. That's pretty good. And as a final step, I'm just going to move the mask up to the group. It doesn't actually make that much of a difference now that I'm almost done, but that way I don't have to, if I modify one of the masks, I don't have to modify the other. So now we'll do one final step back. I'm going to put the original up at the top so I can easily turn it on and off. So there's where we started. There's sort of the finished product. Take out the sky changes, take out the tree changes, take out some of the rock modifications.
Okay, so as you can see, here's where we started. Here's where we ended up. Pretty nice results, about 30-45 minutes worth of editing. Not a huge amount of editing. This was not the only photo we took out in Joshua Tree. If you want to see more, check out Azulux Workshops and amadtrip.com. Both those links are in the description. And if you enjoyed this video, want to see more, go ahead and subscribe. This is our first, but we're going to be putting out a lot more. Thanks.